Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today I'm going to talk to you about the end of chapter 1, and that's on cognitive biases and truth, knowledge. So we'll get to that in a second. First off, what's a cognitive bias? A cognitive bias is an unconscious mental or unconscious psychological state, right? That skews, alters, or otherwise distorts rational belief formation, right? All human beings are subject to these things. They're just byproducts of our evolution, right? And as we go along the list, there's a short list. There are many more than your Moore Parker text contains, but these are some of the big ones. So let's talk about the first one, belief bias. So belief bias is the tendency to evaluate reasoning by the believability of its conclusion. And they give you an example. This example they give you is a 3-line argument, 2 premises, and a conclusion known as a categorical syllogism. We will talk a lot about categorical syllogisms when we get to chapter 9 in a few, about 3/4 of the way through the semester. But let's run down this example really quickly. Premise 1, all pit bulls are dogs. Premise 2, some dogs bite, therefore some pit bulls bite. Now, this is actually not a good argument. It's not a good piece of reasoning, even though it sounds rational. There are complex reasons why, and again, that'll become much more apparent when we get to chapter 9. We start talking about categorical syllogisms. But the long and short of it is, this isn't a good argument because that conclusion is not supported by the premises. Now, it is election season, so this next one is very relevant. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is an unconscious psychological tendency to seek out sources of information that already confirm what you are already inclined to believe in, right? So if you ever wonder why conservatives gravitate toward Fox News and liberals gravitate toward MSNBC, now you know it's confirmation bias. It's a very human tendency. We do not like to entertain arguments that run counter to what we're inclined to believe. We seek out confirmation of what we are inclined to believe. As a good critical thinker, it's your job. You got to resist that tendency, right? All right. Now, before I talk to you about the third one, we got to get clear on the idea of a heuristic. So, remember maybe middle school, grade school, you were learning the names of the notes on the staff, right? In a treble clef. And your teacher gave you the following thing to remember. Every good boy does fine, right? That's the name of the notes on the lines in a treble clef, right? So that's what's known as a heuristic. And a heuristic is a device, a mechanism, right? Something that helps you to remember a factoid, a bit of information, right? So this next cognitive bias is what's known as the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to believe that a phenomenon is much more common than it actually is based on how often you hear about it. So back in the summer of 2014, every American was terrified that they were going to get Ebola. Why? Because every time you turned on the news, you listened to the radio, you went on the internet, you looked at the front page of a newspaper, they were all just bombarding you with talk about Ebola, right? In fact, Americans in general are not, it's highly unlikely that you as an American sitting in California are going to get the Ebola virus ever, right? But the availability heuristic makes you think that it's much more common than it is. All right, so our next cognitive bias, the false consensus effect. False consensus effect is a psychological tendency that leads people to believe that the views that they hold are shared by the people around us and by society at large, right? This is why, for example, believers are so shocked when they meet atheists, right? Oh, I thought everybody believed in me. Well, no, right? Again, that's the false consensus effect. The bandwagon effect, right, is another very common psychological tendency, cognitive bias. That's the tendency to align your thinking with those of your peer group. Now, this is why, for example, juries are selected very, very carefully because lawyers and judges are very aware, right? human beings are social creatures. We're gregarious. I like that word. We're social, and we tend to align our thoughts with those of our peer groups so that we can remain part of the in group, and that's dangerous for a jury that's trying to, for a justice department that's trying to, maintain objectivity, right? For a court of law that's trying to maintain objectivity and determine someone's fate. So again, if you show a clear bias one way or another, you're not going to get selected to a jury, right? All right, this next one, I've got to confess, this cognitive bias affects me every day, and it probably affects you as well. You got to constantly adjust for its presence. That's negativity bias. Negativity bias is an unconscious psychological tendency to place more emphasis, stress, or importance on bad news than on good news, right? People think the world is a much worse place than it is because we are hardwired to focus on the bad. And why would that be? Well, remember, I said all these cognitive biases have evolutionary roots, right? Bandwagon effect definitely does because we're tribal creatures. So does negativity bias. If we have a problem, we must seek a solution. We fixate on it until we find a solution, and that's helped us survive. But the downside is that negativity bias leads us to, again, think of the world as just far, far worse than it actually is. This next one, loss aversion. This is a psychological tendency to prefer to avoid losing rather than accruing a gain, right? Human beings naturally play it safe. We don't gamble, right? And I'll give you an example of this. So a friend of mine's mom, the factory where she was working closed down. And as part of NAFTA, they had to offer these laid off employees either a one-time payout or pay for 2 years of college education at a community college. Most of these former workers chose the one-time payout. They didn't want to be the 30, 40-year-old trying to make trying to get a college education and maybe not make it, right? So that's an example of loss aversion. The next one, in-group bias, and these are the ones that again reflect our nature as social creatures. In-group bias, right? This is a tendency, right, to form negative opinions of people who don't fit into our club, church, party, nationality, or other group. This is why immigrants, for example, get ragged on so hard, right? Human beings are hardwired to think tribally. As a matter of fact, modern anthropologists and psychologists, they believe that the reason modern human beings suffer from such acute levels of stress is because we're trying to navigate a highly technological world with a brain that evolved to deal with situations as they existed on the savannah of Africa 150,000 years ago, right? We evolved to be social creatures in a very small, maybe 50 individuals at most, right? Social unit. This next one, very common, the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is a cognitive bias that leads you to fail to recognize that if you were in someone else's shoes, you would do exactly what they're doing. Here's a mundane example of the fundamental attribution error. You're watching a horror movie, and the guy with the chainsaw is chasing somebody. So rather than run to the car, they run inside a house, right? They run inside a house and they hide in a closet or something, right? And you're like, oh, that's stupid. You should have gone. Well, here's the thing. It's easy for you to say they're being stupid because you're not in danger of being murdered. But if you were in their situation, you'd act exactly as they do because you're terrified and you're not thinking rationally, right? That's the fundamental attribution error. When people criticize immigrants for leaving their home country, they fail to understand, right? Nobody ever left their country because things were going rosy. They were going great. People leave because things are going bad. That's the root of that old adage, people vote with their feet. And if things were awful in your home nation, you do the same thing as those immigrants. All right. This next one, take it with a grain of salt, obedience to authority. So obedience to authority, it's often, there are a couple psychological experiments that are pointed to justify or to provide evidence for the prevalence of this cognitive bias. The first one is a Stanford prison experiment. You can Google that, but basically a psychology professor had a bunch of graduate students play the roles of prison guards and prisoners, right? And after 2 or 3 days, the experiment had to be canceled because the students who were prison guards started abusing the students who were prisoners, right? The other one is the Milgram experiment, in which somebody was asked at the behest of a researcher, right, to press a button that would send a shock to someone behind a partition, right? And the idea was you keep instructing the person to push the button and to ignore the screams that they heard. Well, what happened was the psychologist, Stanley Milgram, he faked the results of the experiment to get more funding for his research. So again, take obedience to authority with a hefty grain of salt. Lastly, there are two related ones. Is the overconfidence effect. That's a self-deception bias that leads us to think that we are better at a certain task than we actually are. And there's the better than average illusion, which leads us to think that we are better relative to a certain task than all of the members of our peer group, right? So really quickly, let's talk about knowledge. Knowledge has traditionally been defined in the philosophical tradition, the Western tradition, as justified true belief. Moore and Parker note, if you have an argument that something is the case, you got no reason to think that you're mistaken, right? Then you can be said to know it. There are problems with that, and I'll post a video that shows you exactly what is problematic about that. Truth. Well, you should know this last little bit. Truth is a concept that philosophers have been debating and arguing about for millennia and will continue to argue about, right? The view that most philosophers adhere to is what's known as the correspondence theory. You can claim that your belief is true if it corresponds to some facts in the world, right? That's fraught with difficulty, but so those are the concepts in chapter 1. Again, email me if you have any questions about anything, and I will talk to you at office hours.